There are things a woman takes to her grave, and there are things she needs to confess before she leaves this world. Today, at 86 years old, sitting on this same porch where it all began, I need to tell the truth about Harold, my Uncle Harold, who became my husband. You might judge me, you might be scandalized, you might think we were monsters. But before you do that, listen to my story. Because sometimes love appears in the most impossible places, and the heart doesn't ask permission to feel. I've had this ring with me for over 70 years. It belonged to my mother, and she gave it to me before she died. I never imagined that one day I would wear it as a woman who loved her own uncle. But life has its own plans. The wind still blows through these Tennessee hills the same way it did back in 1941, when I was just a lost 16-year-old girl with nowhere to go. Harold was 28 then, a bachelor who took me in out of Christian duty after Mama and Daddy died in that car accident. He had kind eyes and gentle hands, and he never once made me feel like a burden. Some stories don't have happy endings, just true ones. And this is mine. Pine Ridge, Tennessee, 1941. That's where this story begins, in a small town where everybody knew everybody's business, or at least they thought they did. I was Ruth Elizabeth Wilson then, 16 years old and fresh out of tragedy. Mama and Daddy had died in a car accident on a rainy October night, driving back from town after selling our last pig at market. The sheriff said Daddy probably fell asleep at the wheel. One moment I had parents, the next I was standing in a black dress at their funeral, wondering what in God's name was going to happen to me. That's when Uncle Harold stepped forward. Harold Wilson, Daddy's younger brother, 28 years old and still a bachelor. He lived alone in a 2-story house on Maple Street, worked at the sawmill, and had a reputation for being quiet, dependable, and kind. After the funeral, when all the casseroles had been eaten and the neighbors had gone home, Harold sat me down at his kitchen table and said, "Ruth, your family. This is your home now, for as long as you need it." He gave me the upstairs bedroom, the one with the white curtains and the window that looked out over the cornfield. He never asked for anything in return, never made me feel like I owed him. He just took care of me. Harold would wake up at 5 every morning, make coffee, and leave biscuits wrapped in a cloth napkin on the counter for when I got up. He'd come home from the mill covered in sawdust, wash up on the back porch, and ask about my day. On Sundays, we'd sit together in the third pew at Pine Ridge Baptist Church, and everyone would nod approvingly at Harold Wilson, such a good Christian man, taking in his orphaned niece. For 2 years, that's exactly what we were. Uncle and niece. He taught me how to drive his old Ford truck, how to balance a checkbook, how to can vegetables for the winter. He was patient with my tears, understanding when I'd wake up screaming from nightmares about the accident. He never tried to replace Daddy, never acted like anything other than what he was, my guardian, my protector, my family. The house had a rhythm to it. Harold would read the newspaper after dinner while I did the dishes. He'd listen to the radio programs, laugh at the comedies, frown at the war news from Europe. Sometimes he'd play his guitar on the porch, old hymns and folk songs his mama had taught him. I'd sit on the porch swing, mending clothes, or just listening, feeling safe for the first time since Mama and Daddy died. People in town called him a saint. That Harold Wilson, they'd say, raising that poor girl all by himself. Never married, but he's got the heart of a father. And Harold seemed content with that life. He never brought women around, never seemed to want anything more than his quiet existence with me as his responsibility. But I was growing up. At 18, I wasn't the broken, skinny 16-year-old who'd shown up at his door with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. I was a woman now, with a woman's body and a woman's feelings. And Harold was still just 28, still handsome in that quiet, steady way that made church ladies whisper about what a good husband he'd make for some lucky girl. That's when everything started to change. Not all at once, but slowly, like the way seasons shift without you noticing until suddenly the leaves have turned and you're in a different world altogether. The impossible love that grows in silence is the cruelest kind. It sits in your chest like a stone, getting heavier every day, until you can barely breathe around it. That's what happened to me in the spring of 1943, when I turned 18 and suddenly saw Harold with different eyes. It wasn't his fault. God knows he never did anything inappropriate, never looked at me the wrong way, never said anything that crossed the line between guardian and ward. But something in me had shifted, and I couldn't shift it back. I'd catch myself watching him shave in the morning, the way his jaw moved, the careful way he held the razor. I'd notice how his hands looked when he turned the pages of his Bible, long fingers that had held me when I cried about Mama and Daddy. I'd see the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders when he chopped wood, and feel something flutter in my stomach that had nothing to do with being his niece. The shame was suffocating. Here was this good man who'd taken me in, sacrificed his own life to raise me, and I was having thoughts that would have scandalized the entire town. I'd pray about it every night, begging God to take these feelings away, to make me normal again. But the heart doesn't listen to prayers, and every day it got worse. Harold would smile at me across the breakfast table, that same gentle smile he'd given me since I was 16, and I'd have to look away because I was afraid he'd see the truth in my eyes. I was falling in love with my uncle, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. The worst part was that I started to notice little things about him too. How he'd linger in the doorway when he said goodnight, like he wanted to say something more. How his voice got softer when he talked to me, different from how he talked to people in town. How sometimes I'd catch him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something that made my heart race and my cheeks burn. I told myself I was imagining it. I had to be imagining it. Because if I wasn't, if Harold was feeling even a fraction of what I was feeling, then we were both walking straight into damnation. I'd seen what happened to people who crossed certain lines in Pine Ridge. Mrs. Henderson had been run out of town for adultery. The Johnson boy had been beaten half to death just for being different. What would they do to a girl who loved her uncle? What would they do to him? But love doesn't care about consequences. It doesn't care about what's right or wrong, what's proper or sinful. It just grows, like kudzu vine, taking over everything until you can't see the landscape anymore. I'd lie awake at night, 3 rooms down from Harold, listening to the old house settle and creak, wondering if he was lying awake too. Wondering if he felt this terrible, wonderful pull between us. Wondering if he hated himself for it the way I hated myself. During the day, I'd try to be normal. I'd cook his meals, clean his house, sit with him at church, smile at the neighbors who praised Harold for his Christian charity. But inside, I was drowning. I was 18 years old, and I was drowning in love for the one man in the world I could never have. The one man who'd shown me nothing but kindness, who deserved better than a niece who wanted to be something else entirely. That's the wound that drove everything that came after. Not just the love, but the shame of it. The knowledge that I was broken in a way that couldn't be fixed, wanting something I couldn't name, feeling something I couldn't stop. The night everything changed was a Tuesday in June, 1943. I remember it exactly because it was the night before my 18th birthday, and Harold had been acting strange all week. Not bad strange, just different. He'd been quieter than usual, spending more time on the porch after dinner, smoking his pipe and staring out at the cornfield like he was wrestling with something he couldn't name. I'd catch him watching me sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, with this expression that made my stomach flip over. Not the way he'd looked at me when I was 16 and broken. This was something else entirely. Something that made the air between us feel thick and electric, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. That Tuesday night, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when Harold came in from the porch. Usually he'd say goodnight and head upstairs, but instead he stood in the doorway, just watching me work. I could feel his eyes on me, and my hand started shaking so bad I nearly dropped a plate. Ruth, he said finally, and his voice was different. Rougher somehow, like he'd been thinking about whatever he was going to say for a long time. Tomorrow you'll be 18. I kept washing the same dish over and over, not trusting myself to turn around. Yes, sir, I managed to say. I've been thinking, he continued, and I heard him take a step closer. You're not a little girl anymore. Haven't been for a while now. The dish slipped from my hands into the soapy water. I gripped the edge of the sink, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I know, I whispered. And I've been thinking that maybe it's time we talked about your future. About what you want. That's when I finally turned around, and the look on his face nearly knocked me over. Harold was standing maybe 3 feet away from me, his hands clenched at his sides, and he was looking at me the way a man looks at a woman he wants. Not the way an uncle looks at his niece. Not the way a guardian looks at his ward. The way a man looks at a woman he's been trying not to want for months. What I want. I repeated, my voice barely audible. He took another step closer, close enough that I could smell the tobacco from his pipe, the soap he'd used to wash the sawdust from his hands. Ruth, he said, and my name sounded different in his mouth. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Do you? He started, then stopped, running a hand through his hair. Do you ever think about leaving Pine Ridge? Getting married, starting your own family? The question hit me like a physical blow. The thought of leaving Harold, of marrying someone else, of pretending to be normal while my heart belonged to the one man I could never have, made me feel like I was suffocating. No, I said quickly, too quickly. I don't want to leave. Something shifted in his eyes. Why not? And that's when I made the mistake that changed everything. I looked right at him, with all my love and longing written across my face like words on a page, and I said, because everything I want is right here. Harold went very still. For a long moment, we just stared at each other across that kitchen, the air between us crackling with all the things we couldn't say. Then he took one more step, close enough to touch, and whispered, Ruth, we can't. But even as he said it, his hand came up to cup my cheek, his thumb brushing across my skin like he was memorizing the feel of it. I know, I whispered back, but I didn't pull away. I leaned into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun. I've tried to stop feeling this way. I've tried to think of you as just my uncle, but Harold. I can't. His eyes closed like I'd caused him physical pain. You're 18 tomorrow, he said, his voice hoarse. 18, Ruth. And I'm 30. I'm your guardian. I'm supposed to protect you, not. Not what? I asked, even though I knew the answer. Not want you the way I want you, he finished, and the confession hung between us like a bridge we were both afraid to cross. That was the moment. That was when Uncle Harold became something else, when I stopped being just his niece. We didn't kiss that night. We didn't do anything but stand there in that kitchen, his hand on my face, admitting what we'd both been trying to deny for months. But everything changed. The line had been crossed, even if it was just with words. After that night in the kitchen, everything between Harold and me became a battlefield. Not angry or violent, but the kind of quiet war that happens when two people are fighting the same enemy and that enemy is themselves. We'd confessed our feelings, but we hadn't acted on them, and somehow that made everything worse. Now we both knew the truth, and we had to live with it every single day. The next morning was my 18th birthday, and Harold made pancakes, same as he did every year. But when he handed me my plate, our fingers touched for just a second longer than they should have, and I saw him close his eyes like it hurt. Happy birthday, Ruth, he said, and his voice was so careful, so controlled, that I knew he'd been up all night thinking about what happened in the kitchen. Thank you, I whispered, and we ate breakfast in silence, both of us pretending that everything was normal when nothing would ever be normal again. For the next 2 weeks, we danced around each other like we were made of glass. Harold would come home from the mill and sit on the porch instead of coming inside. I'd find excuses to stay upstairs when he was reading his newspaper. We were both trying so hard to be appropriate, to go back to being uncle and niece, that we could barely function. But you can't unsay words like the ones we'd said. You can't unknow that the person you love feels the same way. It changes the air between you, makes every innocent moment feel dangerous. When Harold would pass me the salt at dinner, I'd feel electricity shoot up my arm. When I'd hand him his coffee in the morning, he'd look at my mouth like he was remembering how close we'd been in that kitchen. The worst part was the guilt. During the day, when Harold was at work, I'd sit in the parlor and think about what we were becoming. I'd look at the picture of Mama and Daddy on the mantel and wonder what they'd think if they knew their daughter was in love with their son. I'd think about the people at church, how they trusted Harold, how they called him a good Christian man. What would they say if they knew he was falling in love with the girl he was supposed to protect? I'd pray until my knees were raw, begging God to take these feelings away from both of us. Make us normal, I'd whisper into my clasped hands. Make him my uncle again. Make me his niece again. This is wrong, and we both know it's wrong, so please, please fix us. But God wasn't listening, or maybe he was listening and this was his answer. Because every day, instead of getting easier, it got harder. Harold started working late, staying at the mill until after dark, coming home exhausted and covered in more sawdust than usual. I knew he was trying to avoid being alone with me, and part of me was grateful. But part of me, the part one was most ashamed of, was hurt. I'd cook his dinner and leave it covered on the stove, then go to bed before he got home, just so I wouldn't have to see him trying so hard not to want me. But late at night, I'd hear him moving around downstairs, and I'd lie in my bed imagining him sitting at that kitchen table, eating alone, thinking about me. Sometimes I'd hear him on the porch, playing his guitar real soft, and I'd recognize the songs. Love songs. Songs about wanting things you couldn't have. I'd press my face into my pillow and cry, because I knew he was thinking about me the same way I was thinking about him. Then there were the moments when his resolve would crack, just a little. Like when I'd be hanging laundry on the line and he'd come around the corner of the house unexpected. He'd stop short, seeing me there with my arms raised, pinning his shirts next to my dresses, and for just a second his mask would slip. I'd see hunger in his eyes, raw and desperate, before he'd catch himself and look away. "Excuse me," he'd mutter, and disappear back around the house like I'd burned him. Or the Sunday when it rained during church, and we had to run to the truck together. We were both soaked by the time we got inside, laughing despite ourselves, and when Harold reached over to brush a wet strand of hair from my face, we both went very still. His hand lingered on my cheek, his thumb tracing the same path it had that night in the kitchen, and I leaned into his touch without thinking. For a moment, sitting in that truck with rain drumming on the roof, we weren't uncle and niece. We were just Harold and Ruth, two people who loved each other and didn't know how to stop. Then a car honked behind us, and the spell broke. Harold jerked his hand away like I'd slapped him, started the engine, and drove us home in complete silence. I started to wonder if we could keep this up forever, this careful dance of wanting and denying. Part of me hoped we could, because at least this way we weren't crossing the final line. We weren't actually sinning, just wanting to sin. But another part of me, the part that grew stronger every day, wondered what would happen if we stopped fighting it. What would happen if we just let ourselves love each other the way we wanted to? I'd catch myself imagining it sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet. What it would be like if Harold came to my room, if we stopped pretending, if we gave in to what we both wanted. The thought terrified me and thrilled me in equal measure. Because I knew, deep in my bones, that we were both losing this battle. Every day, Harold's resolve grew a little thinner. Every day, I got a little braver, a little more willing to risk everything for the chance to be loved by him. We were walking toward a cliff, both of us, and sooner or later, one of us was going to fall. The storm that changed everything came on a Thursday night in July. I remember because Harold had been working 6 days a week at the mill, trying to avoid me, and Thursday was supposed to be his night off. But instead of staying home, he'd driven into town to visit his friend Charles, probably looking for any excuse to not be alone with me in that house that felt smaller every day. I was in the parlor, mending one of his work shirts by lamplight, when the thunder started rolling in from the west. At first it was just distant rumbling, but within an hour the whole sky had turned black, and rain was coming down so hard it sounded like bullets hitting the roof. I kept glancing at the clock, worrying about Harold driving that old Ford truck on muddy roads in weather like this. By 9 o'clock, I was pacing by the front windows, watching for his headlights through the sheets of rain. By 10, I was genuinely scared. That truck wasn't reliable on a good day, and these weren't good roads even when they were dry. When I finally saw those headlights wavering up our driveway, I nearly cried with relief. I ran to the front door and flung it open just as Harold reached the porch, and he was soaked through to the skin. His hair was plastered to his head, his shirt was transparent with rainwater, and he was shivering so hard his teeth were chattering. "Good Lord, Harold," I said, pulling him inside. "You're freezing. Get out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia." He stood there dripping on Mama's good rug, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. "I shouldn't have stayed so late," he said, his voice rough. "I was trying to." "Trying to what?" I asked, though I thought I already knew. "Trying to stay away from you," he admitted, and the honesty of it hit me like a physical blow. "Harold," I whispered, but he held up a hand to stop me. "I need to get cleaned up," he said, heading for the stairs. "I'll just..." But before he could finish that sentence, the lights went out. The storm had knocked out the power, plunging us into complete darkness. I heard Harold curse softly, heard him bump into something in the hallway. "Don't move," I called out. "I'll get the oil lamps." I fumbled my way to the kitchen by memory, found the matches and the kerosene lamp we kept for emergencies. The warm yellow light filled the room, pushing back the darkness, and when I carried it back to the front hall, Harold was still standing exactly where I'd left him, dripping and shivering. "Here," I said, setting the lamp on the hall table. "Let me help you." I don't know what possessed me to say that. Maybe it was seeing him so vulnerable, maybe it was the intimacy of the lamplight and the storm raging outside, but before I could think better of it, I was reaching for the buttons of his soaked shirt. "Ruth," he said, his voice strained, but he didn't stop me. His hands hung at his sides as I worked the buttons free, one by one, my fingers brushing against his skin. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could hear his breathing getting shallow as I pushed the wet fabric off his shoulders. "You're going to get sick," I murmured, but that wasn't why I was undressing him, and we both knew it. I was undressing him because I wanted to touch him, because I'd been dreaming about this moment for months, because the storm had washed away all my good intentions. He was beautiful in the lamplight, his chest broad and strong from years of mill work, his skin golden and warm. I let my hands rest on his chest for just a moment, feeling his heart hammering against my palms, and when I looked up at his face, I saw that he was looking at me like a man who was drowning. "Ruth," he said again, but this time it sounded like a prayer. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered, not moving my hands. "This pretending. This fighting what we both want. You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "If we cross this line, there's no going back. People will." "People don't have to know," I said, and the words hung between us like a bridge. "It's just us in this house. Just us in this storm. Just us, Harold." He closed his eyes, and I saw the exact moment when his resolve finally cracked. When 30 years of being a good man, a Christian man, a responsible man, collided with the simple truth that he loved me and I loved him and life was too short to waste on pretending otherwise. When he opened his eyes again, they were full of decision. Ruth, he said, and this time my name sounded like a confession. I love you. God help me, I love you, and I can't fight it anymore. Then don't, I whispered, and rose up on my toes to kiss him. The moment our lips touched, it was like the storm outside had moved inside us. 3 months of wanting, of denying, of careful distance, all exploded in that single kiss. Harold's arms came around me like he was afraid I might disappear, pulling me against his bare chest, and I could taste the rain on his lips, feel the desperation in the way he held me. We kissed like we were drowning, like we were the last two people on earth, like we'd been waiting our whole lives for this moment. And maybe we had been. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard, Harold rested his forehead against mine. "What are we doing?" he whispered. "We're being honest," I said, my hand still flat against his chest. "For the first time in months, we're being honest." "This is going to change everything," he said. "Everything is already changed," I replied. "It changed the night you told me you wanted me. It changed the day I stopped being able to think of you as my uncle. We can keep pretending, keep torturing ourselves, or we can." "We can what?" he asked, though I think he already knew. "We can love each other," I said simply. "Whatever that means, whatever the consequences, we can stop fighting and just love each other." Harold looked at me for a long moment, this woman who had been his niece and his ward and his responsibility, who was now something else entirely. Then he picked up the oil lamp with one hand, took my hand with the other, and led me toward the stairs. "Then let's love each other," he said, and in that moment, Uncle Harold died and my Harold was born. We climbed those stairs together, the lamp casting our shadows long and strange on the walls, the storm still raging outside but somehow less important now than the storm we'd finally stopped fighting inside ourselves. At the top of the stairs, Harold paused outside my bedroom door. "Are you sure?" he asked one last time. "I've been sure for months," I said, and opened the door myself. That night, in that little bedroom with the white curtains and the window that looked out over the cornfield, everything changed. Harold stopped being my uncle, and I stopped being his niece. We became something new, something that didn't have a name but felt more real than anything either of us had ever known. The morning after the storm, I woke up in Harold's arms for the first time in my life, and for a moment, I forgot everything except how right it felt. The sun was streaming through his bedroom window, painting everything golden, and Harold was still asleep, his face peaceful in a way I hadn't seen in months. I could hear birds singing outside, could smell coffee brewing downstairs. He must have set the pot the night before, and everything felt perfect and normal and completely impossible all at the same time. Then reality hit me like a bucket of cold water. What had we done? I was lying naked in my uncle's bed, in broad daylight, in a house on Maple Street where any neighbor might come calling. Mrs. Patterson next door had a habit of bringing over biscuits on Friday mornings. The mailman, Mr. Jenkins, always knocked if he had a package. What if someone had seen Harold's truck in the driveway all night? What if someone came looking for us? Harold stirred beside me, and when he opened his eyes and saw me there, I watched the same realization cross his face. For just a second, he smiled, soft and sleepy and full of love. Then his expression changed, and I saw the weight of what we'd done settle on his shoulders like a yoke. "Good morning," he said quietly, his voice careful, testing. "Good morning," I replied, and we looked at each other across that pillow, both of us wondering if we were going to regret this for the rest of our lives. "Ruth," he started, and I could hear him trying to find the words to take it all back, to return us to the safe ground of uncle and niece. "Don't," I said quickly, pressing my fingers to his lips. "Don't you dare apologize for last night. Don't you dare tell me it was a mistake." He closed his eyes, caught my hand, and kissed my palm. "It wasn't a mistake," he said finally. "But we need to be careful. More careful than we've ever been in our lives." That's when our double life began. From the outside, nothing changed. Harold still left for the mill every morning at 6:30, still came home covered in sawdust, still sat on the porch after dinner reading his newspaper. I still cooked and cleaned and tended the garden, still walked to the post office every Tuesday, still sat in the third pew at Pine Ridge Baptist Church every Sunday morning. To everyone in town, we were still the same Harold Wilson and his orphan niece Ruth, the girl he'd taken in out of Christian charity. The model guardian and his grateful ward. But inside that house, behind those closed doors, we were something else entirely. We were lovers. We were partners. We were two people who had found something precious and dangerous and worth protecting at any cost. The deception required a level of planning and caution that exhausted us both. During the day, when Harold was at work, I'd strip our bed and wash the sheets separately from everything else, hanging them on the line in the backyard where Mrs. Patterson couldn't see them from her kitchen window. I'd make sure there were never two coffee cups in the sink at the same time, never any evidence that we'd shared a meal or a morning or anything more intimate than guardian and ward should share. Harold would sleep in his own room whenever we expected visitors, which meant I had to keep his bed looking lived in even when he'd spent the night in mine. We developed a system of signals. If Harold saw a neighbor heading toward our house, he'd cough twice as he came through the front door, giving me time to smooth my hair, check my dress, make sure I looked like someone who'd been doing housework instead of kissing her uncle in the kitchen. If someone knocked unexpectedly, I'd answer the door while Harold made himself scarce, usually heading out to the back porch or the shed, anywhere he wouldn't have to look our visitors in the eye while lying about who we were to each other. The hardest part was Sunday mornings. We'd sit in that pew together, Harold in his good suit, me in my blue dress with the white collar, and Pastor Morrison would preach about sin and temptation and the sanctity of family. I'd feel the eyes of the whole congregation on us, all those good Christian people who thought they knew exactly what they were looking at. "Harold Wilson is such a fine man," Mrs. Henderson whispered to Mrs. Clark one Sunday. "Raising that girl all by himself, never complaining, never asking for help. She's lucky to have such a devoted uncle." I felt Harold's hand tighten on his Bible, felt the tension radiating from him like heat. After church, people would praise him for his sacrifice, his Christian generosity, his patience with a teenage girl who could be difficult, though I'd never given him a moment's trouble. They'd pat him on the back and tell him he was a saint, and Harold would smile and nod and say it was his pleasure, his duty, his privilege to care for family. Then we'd drive home in silence, both of us sick with the weight of our deception. But once we were safely behind our own front door, once the curtains were drawn and the door was locked, we could breathe again. Harold would pull me into his arms right there in the front hallway, kissing me like a man who'd been holding his breath underwater. "I hate lying to them," he'd whisper against my hair. "I hate pretending you're just my niece when you're everything to me." "I know," I'd whisper back. "But what else can we do?" And that was the question that haunted us both. What else could we do? We couldn't leave Pine Ridge. Harold's job was here, his life was here, and where would we go? How would we explain it? We couldn't tell people the truth, they'd run us out of town, or worse. We couldn't stop loving each other, we'd tried that for months, and it had nearly killed us both. So we lived this strange, split existence, public and private, sacred and secret. During the day, I was Ruth Wilson, the grateful orphan. At night, I was Ruth, the woman Harold loved with a passion that sometimes scared us both. We developed our own private language, a way of communicating in front of others that looked innocent but carried hidden meanings. When Harold would say, "Ruth, would you mind bringing me some coffee?" at the dinner table when we had company, he was really saying, "I need to touch you, and this is the only way I can do it safely." When I'd reply, "Of course, Uncle Harold," I was really saying, "I know, I feel it too, just wait until they leave." The smallest gestures became loaded with significance. Harold passing me the salted dinner was an excuse to brush his fingers against mine. Me adjusting his collar before church was a way to touch him, to reassure myself that he was real, that this impossible love was real. We lived for those moments of contact, brief and careful and never long enough. The paranoia was constant. Every knock at the door, every unexpected visitor, every time someone looked at us a little too long or asked a question that seemed to probe deeper than casual interest, we'd wonder if they suspected. If they'd seen something, noticed something, put together pieces that would destroy us both. Mrs. Patterson's weekly visits for coffee became exercises in acting. I'd sit across from her at the kitchen table, discussing recipes and weather and church gossip, while mentally calculating whether the bed upstairs was properly made, whether Harold's razor was in the right bathroom, whether there was any evidence of the life we really lived. "You're so lucky, dear," she'd say, stirring her coffee. "Having Harold to look after you. Some men wouldn't take on the responsibility of a young woman. They'd send you to relatives or find you a husband right quick." "Yes, ma'am," I'd agree, my heart pounding. "Uncle Harold is very good to me." If she only knew how good. If she only knew that the night before, Harold had held me while I cried about Mama and Daddy, had kissed away my tears and told me I was the most beautiful thing in his world. If she only knew that this morning, I'd woken up in his arms and felt, for the first time since my parents died, like I was home. The strain of it was wearing on both of us. Harold started losing weight, the constant stress eating away at him. I developed headaches, tension that lived in my shoulders and neck from always being on guard. We'd lie in bed at night, holding each other, and wonder how long we could keep this up. How long before someone noticed that Harold never courted any of the eligible ladies in town, never showed interest in marriage? How long before someone realized that I wasn't looking for a husband either, wasn't interested in any of the young men who tried to catch my eye after church? How long before someone realized that I wasn't looking for a husband either, wasn't interested in any of the young men who tried to catch my eye after church? How long before our love became too big to hide? But even with all the fear, all the exhaustion, all the constant vigilance, I wouldn't have changed anything. Because for the first time in my life, I knew what it felt like to be truly loved. Not cared for, not protected, not tolerated, but loved with the kind of passion that makes you feel like you could conquer the world or die trying. Harold loved me like I was precious, like I was chosen, like I was worth risking everything for. And I loved him the same way, with a fierceness that surprised us both. We were living on borrowed time, and we both knew it. But every stolen moment felt like a lifetime, every secret kiss felt like a revolution, every night in each other's arms felt like proof that sometimes, even in a world full of rules and expectations and proper behavior, love finds a way. The moment that nearly destroyed everything happened on a Wednesday afternoon in September, 6 weeks after Harold and I had become lovers. I was hanging laundry in the backyard, humming softly to myself, when I heard Mrs. Patterson's voice calling over the fence. "Ruth, honey, is Harold home?" She was standing in her garden, holding a basket of tomatoes, but something about her tone made my stomach clench. "No, ma'am," I called back, trying to keep my voice light. "He's at the mill. Won't be home until 6. "Oh," she said, and there was something in that single word that made me stop pinning Harold's shirt to the line. "Well, I was just wondering because I saw his truck in the driveway real early this morning. Around 5:30. Thought maybe he was feeling poorly." My blood turned to ice. Harold had worked late the night before, hadn't gotten home until almost midnight, and we'd been so tired we'd forgotten our usual caution. He'd parked in his normal spot instead of around back where the neighbors couldn't see, and we'd slept in until nearly 6. Mrs. Patterson would have been up making coffee, would have seen his truck still there when Harold should have already left for work. "Oh," I managed, my mind racing. He had some trouble with the engine yesterday. Had to work on it this morning before he could drive to the mill." It was a weak lie, and I could tell from Mrs. Patterson's expression that she knew it. Harold's truck might be old, but it was reliable, and everyone in town knew he maintained it religiously. She said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Funny thing is, I didn't hear any engine trouble." Usually when cars won't start, there's quite a commotion. I felt trapped, pinned between her suspicious gaze and the wet laundry flapping in the breeze behind me. Maybe you were inside making breakfast, I suggested weakly. Couldn't hear it from your kitchen. Maybe, she agreed, but she didn't sound convinced. Ruth, honey, can I ask you something? Of course, I said, though every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. You and Harold, you get along well, don't you? The question seemed innocent enough, but there was something underneath it, something probing and dangerous. Yes, ma'am, I said carefully. Uncle Harold has been very good to me. Oh, I'm sure he has, Mrs. Patterson said, and the way she said it made my skin crawl. It's just that, well, you're 18 now, aren't you? A grown woman. And Harold, he's still a young man himself. 30 years old, good-looking, never been married. She let the words hang in the air like smoke. I just worry sometimes about the two of you living alone in that house. People might start to talk. Talk about what? I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. Oh, you know how small towns are, she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. People see a single man and a pretty young woman under the same roof, and their minds start to wander. Even when it's perfectly innocent family business. The word innocent sounded like an accusation in her mouth. I forced myself to laugh, a sound that came out higher and more nervous than I intended. Mrs. Patterson, Harold is my uncle. He's family. The idea that people would think. I'm not saying I think anything improper, she said quickly, but her eyes were sharp and calculating. I'm just saying that appearances matter in a town like this. Maybe it's time Harold started thinking about finding you a nice young man to marry. Get you settled in your own home, with your own family. It would be better for everyone. The implication was clear, she suspected something, and she was warning me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to the clothespins. I appreciate your concern, I said, my voice barely steady. But Harold and I are perfectly fine as we are. I'm sure you are, honey, Mrs. Patterson said, but her tone suggested anything but certainty. I'm sure you are. Well, I'd better get these tomatoes inside before they spoil. You tell Harold I stopped by, won't you? Yes, ma'am, I whispered. I watched her walk back to her house, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. She knew. Maybe she didn't have proof, maybe she couldn't say exactly what she suspected, but she knew something wasn't right. And if Mrs. Patterson suspected, how long before the rest of the town started asking questions? How long before someone decided to investigate more closely? That evening, when Harold came home from work, I met him at the door with tears streaming down my face. We need to talk, I said, and the fear in my voice made him go pale. I told him everything about Mrs. Patterson's visit, her questions, the way she'd looked at me like she could see right through our carefully constructed lies. Harold listened without interrupting, his face growing more grim with every word. She knows, I finished. Maybe not everything, but she knows something. Harold was quiet for a long moment, staring out the kitchen window toward Mrs. Patterson's house. How long do you think we have? He asked finally. Before she tells someone else? Before the whole town starts watching us? I don't know, I said. Maybe she won't say anything. Maybe she's just suspicious. Or maybe she's already talking, Harold said grimly. Maybe she's been watching us for weeks, putting pieces together. Ruth, if this gets out. He didn't need to finish that sentence. We both knew what would happen. Harold would lose his job, his reputation, his place in the community. I'd be branded as a fallen woman, a seductress who'd corrupted her own uncle. We'd both be outcasts, if we were lucky. If we weren't lucky, things could get much worse. What are we going to do? I whispered. Harold looked at me with eyes full of love and terror and determination. I don't know, he said. but whatever happens, we face it together. The weeks following Mrs. Patterson's visit were the longest of my life. Every day felt like walking through a minefield, never knowing when the next step might trigger an explosion that would destroy everything Harold and I had built together. We became prisoners in our own home, hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every neighbor who lingered too long in their yard or glanced our way with what might have been curiosity. Harold started working longer hours at the mill, not because he wanted to avoid me, but because he thought it might throw off suspicion. If I'm hardly ever home, he reasoned, maybe people will stop wondering what goes on between us. But it backfired. Instead of seeming innocent, Harold's absence made people wonder why a devoted uncle would suddenly start avoiding his young niece. Mrs. Clark mentioned at the post office that it seemed strange Harold was working so much overtime when his niece was home alone so often. "That poor girl," she said, loud enough for half the town to hear. "All alone in that big house. It's not natural for a young woman to spend so much time by herself." When Harold was home, we could barely look at each other without feeling like we were being watched. We stopped our secret touches, stopped our stolen moments in the kitchen. We ate dinner in virtual silence, both of us straining to hear if anyone was approaching the house, if Mrs. Patterson was in her garden where she might overhear our conversation. The physical distance was torture, but the emotional distance was worse. We were both so afraid of being discovered that we started treating each other like strangers again, and I could see it was killing Harold just as much as it was killing me. Sleep became impossible. Harold would lie in his own bed, 3 rooms away from mine, and I'd lie in mine, both of us staring at the ceiling and wondering if this was how it would be from now on. Were we going to spend the rest of our lives pretending we didn't love each other? Were we going to grow old in the same house, acting like uncle and niece while our hearts broke a little more each day? 2 weeks after Mrs. Patterson's visit, the real consequences started. Harold came home from work one evening looking like someone had died, his face gray and his hands shaking. "What happened?" I asked, forgetting our new careful distance, rushing to him like I used to. "Mr. Anderson pulled me aside today," Harold said, naming his supervisor at the mill. "Asked me some questions about my home situation." My stomach dropped. "What kind of questions?" Whether I thought it was appropriate for a single man to be raising a teenage girl alone. Whether I'd considered finding Ruth a husband, settling her down with her own family. Whether I understood how it might look to people in town. Harold's voice was hollow, defeated. He said he wasn't accusing me of anything improper, but that people had been talking, and the mill couldn't afford to employ someone who was the subject of gossip. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. "What did you tell him?" What could I tell him? Harold snapped, then immediately looked stricken. "I'm sorry, Ruth. I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at this whole damn situation." I told him you were family, that I was doing my Christian duty, that anyone who thought otherwise had dirty minds and no business speculating about decent people. Did he believe you? "I don't know," Harold said honestly. He said the matter was closed for now, but that I should think about making some changes to my living arrangements. For the good of everyone involved. The threat was clear. If the gossip continued, if more people started asking questions, Harold would lose his job. And without his job, we'd have no money, no way to stay in Pine Ridge, no way to maintain even the pretense of our current life. But it got worse. The next Sunday at church, I felt the stares like physical weight. People who used to smile and nod at us now watched us with calculating eyes, whispering behind their hands when they thought we weren't looking. During the sermon, Pastor Morrison spoke about temptation, about the dangers of putting ourselves in situations where sin might flourish, about the importance of proper behavior and appropriate relationships. I was sure he was looking directly at Harold and me as he spoke, and I saw Harold's jaw clench so tight I was afraid his teeth might crack. After the service, instead of the usual friendly chatter, people seemed to avoid us. Mrs. Henderson, who used to always ask about my health and compliment my dresses, walked past us without a word. The Johnson family, who'd been neighbors for years, suddenly found urgent business on the other side of the churchyard when they saw us approaching. Most devastating of all, when we reached our truck, we found a note tucked under the windshield wiper. In careful handwriting, someone had written, "A man who takes advantage of family trust brings shame on the whole community. Do right by that girl or face the consequences." Harold read it twice, his face going white, then crumpled it up and shoved it in his pocket. We drove home in complete silence, both of us knowing that our secret was no longer secret. People knew, or at least suspected, and they were warning us. The question was, what did "face the consequences" mean? That night, we sat on opposite ends of the living room, not talking, both lost in our own fears. Finally, Harold spoke. "Maybe they're right," he said quietly. "Maybe I should find you a husband. Get you settled somewhere safe, away from all this." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Harold, no," I said, starting to rise from my chair. "Don't," he said, holding up a hand to stop me. "Don't make this harder than it already is. Ruth, I love you more than my own life, but look what loving you is costing us both. My job, my reputation, your standing in the community. People are starting to treat you like you're already a fallen woman, and you haven't done anything wrong except love me back." "I don't care what people think," I said fiercely. "Yes, you do," Harold replied sadly. "And so do I. We both care, because we have to live in this world. And this world doesn't have a place for people like us." "Then we'll make our own place," I said, but even as I said it, I could hear how naive it sounded. Harold gave me a look full of such heartbreak that I started to cry. "Where, Ruth? Where in this world can a man live openly with his niece? Where can we go that people won't ask questions, won't want to know our story? We can't run from this. It'll follow us wherever we go." The walls felt like they were closing in. Every day brought new evidence that our love was destroying us both. Harold lost weight, stopped sleeping, jumped at every unexpected sound. I caught him staring at nothing sometimes, his eyes hollow and defeated, and I knew he was thinking about what it would mean to give me up, to live the rest of his life pretending I was just his niece again. I was losing him, inch by inch, day by day, not to another woman or to death, but to fear. To the crushing weight of a society that couldn't accept what we were to each other. And the worst part was, I was starting to think he might be right. Maybe we couldn't keep living like this. Maybe loving each other was selfish, was hurting more than just ourselves. Maybe the price of our happiness was too high for both of us to pay. But even thinking that felt like dying, and I wasn't ready to die for the comfort of people who couldn't understand that love doesn't always follow the rules they want it to follow. The question was, how much longer could we hold on before one of us broke completely? The end came on a cold October morning, 3 months after Mrs. Patterson first knocked on the wall of our carefully constructed lie. I was in the kitchen making breakfast when I heard the sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Multiple sets of footsteps on our front porch, followed by a knock that was too loud, too official, too final to be anything but disaster. Harold was already dressed for work, drinking his coffee at the kitchen table, when the knock came. We looked at each other across that familiar space, and I saw in his eyes the same knowledge that was flooding through me. This was it. This was the moment we'd been dreading for months. "Ruth," Harold said quietly, setting down his coffee cup with hands that were remarkably steady. "Whatever happens, remember that I love you. Remember that none of this was your fault." Before I could answer, the knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by a voice that made my blood freeze. "Harold Wilson. We need to speak with you." It was Sheriff Morrison, Pastor Morrison's older brother, and he wasn't alone. Through the front window, I could see at least 3 other men on our porch, including Mr. Anderson from the mill and Dr. Hartwell, who served as the town's unofficial moral authority. Harold stood up slowly, smoothed down his hair, and walked toward the front door like a man walking to his execution. "Stay in the kitchen," he told me over his shoulder. "Whatever they say, whatever they ask, you stay in the kitchen." But I couldn't do that. I couldn't let him face this alone. I followed him to the front hallway, staying back in the shadows where I could hear everything but hopefully not be seen. Harold opened the door, and the cold morning air rushed in along with the voices of righteous men who'd come to save the community from scandal. "Gentlemen," Harold said, his voice calm and controlled. "What can I do for you?" "Harold," Sheriff Morrison said, and his tone was grave, official, the voice of law and order confronting sin. "We need to talk about your living situation." "About the girl." "Ruth is my niece," Harold said evenly. "She's family. I don't see what concern that is of yours." "Cut the act, Harold," Mr. Anderson snapped. "Half the town knows what's going on in this house. You think we're blind? You think we're stupid? I think you're good Christian men who've let gossip and speculation cloud your judgment," Harold replied, but I could hear the strain creeping into his voice. "There's nothing improper happening here." "Nothing improper?" Dr. Hartwell stepped forward, his voice dripping with disgust. "Harold, I've known you since you were a boy. Your father was a good man, a godly man. What do you think he'd say if he could see what you've become?" "What exactly do you think I've become?" Harold asked, and there was a challenge in his voice that made my heart race with fear and pride in equal measure. "A man who takes advantage of a young girl who has nowhere else to go," Sheriff Morrison said bluntly. "A man who uses his position as guardian to satisfy his own base desires. A man who's brought shame on this entire community." "That's enough," Harold said, and his voice went cold and dangerous. "You have no proof of any wrongdoing because there hasn't been any wrongdoing. Ruth is safe in my care, and she's happy. Whatever sick fantasies you've cooked up in your heads have nothing to do with reality." But then Dr. Hartwell said the words that destroyed everything: "We have a witness, Harold. Someone who's seen things. Someone who's been watching." My knees nearly gave out. A witness. Someone had seen us together, had watched us when we thought we were safe, had gathered evidence of our love and turned it into ammunition against us. "What witness?" Harold demanded, but his voice was shaking now. "What exactly do you think someone has seen?" "Mrs. Patterson has been concerned about the girl for months," Sheriff Morrison said. "She's documented some very interesting observations. Late-night visits to your bedroom, Harold. Intimate conversations on the porch. The girl calling you by your first name when she thinks no one can hear. Kisses that last too long and touches that aren't appropriate between an uncle and his niece." Each word hit me like a physical blow. Mrs. Patterson hadn't just suspected, she'd been spying on us, watching us, cataloging every stolen moment of affection. How many times had she seen Harold kiss me goodnight? How many private conversations had she overheard? How many of our careful secrets had been nothing more than performances for an audience we didn't know we had? Furthermore, Dr. Hartwell continued, there are concerns about the girl's condition. "What condition?" Harold asked, his voice barely audible. "She's been seen at Dr. Reynolds' office in Millerville," Sheriff Morrison said. "Twice in the past month. For women's troubles. The kind of troubles that might result from improper relations." The world tilted sideways. They thought I was pregnant. They thought Harold had gotten me pregnant, and that's why I'd been seeing a doctor. The truth was so much more innocent and so much more impossible to explain. I'd been having terrible headaches from the stress of hiding our relationship, and I'd driven to Millerville because I was afraid to see Dr. Hartwell, afraid he'd ask questions about why a young woman who lived with her uncle was under so much strain. But how could I explain that without admitting everything else? "You're wrong," Harold said, but his voice sounded broken. "You're all wrong about everything." "Are we?" Mr. Anderson stepped closer to the door. Then you won't mind if Ruth comes out here and answers some questions for herself. If everything is so innocent, if you've got nothing to hide, then she can tell us herself that nothing improper has happened between you. That's when I knew I couldn't hide in the shadows anymore. I couldn't let Harold bear this alone, couldn't let him try to protect me when protection was impossible. I stepped out of the hallway and into the doorway beside Harold, and the looks on those men's faces told me everything I needed to know about what they thought of me. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "You wanted to speak with me?" "Ruth," Sheriff Morrison said, his tone gentler than it had been with Harold, the voice of a man speaking to a victim rather than a perpetrator. "We need you to tell us the truth about your relationship with Harold. We know this situation has been difficult for you. We know you might feel afraid to speak honestly while he's standing right there. But you're safe now. You can tell us what's really been happening in this house." I looked at these four men, these pillars of our community, these righteous defenders of moral order, and I made a choice that would change everything. "What's been happening," I said clearly, "is that Harold took me in when I had nowhere else to go. He gave me a home, and kindness, and safety, and love. And yes, I love him back. Not the way a niece loves an uncle, but the way a woman loves a man. And if that makes me a fallen woman in your eyes, then so be it." The silence that followed was deafening. Harold turned to stare at me, his face white with shock and terror. The four men on our porch looked like I'd slapped them. "Ruth," Dr. Hartwell said finally, his voice thick with disgust. "Do you understand what you're saying? Do you understand what you're confessing to?" "I understand perfectly," I said, reaching for Harold's hand. "I'm confessing to loving the best man I've ever known. I'm confessing to finding happiness in a world that tried to take everything from me. I'm confessing to being exactly what you think I am." Harold squeezed my hand so tight it hurt, but he didn't let go. "Ruth, don't," he whispered. "They'll destroy us both." "They were going to destroy us anyway," I said, looking right into Sheriff Morrison's eyes. "At least this way, we go down telling the truth." And that's how our secret died, not with a whisper, but with a declaration. Not with shame, but with defiance. Not with separation, but with my hand in Harold's, facing down the judgment of a town that could never understand that sometimes love appears in impossible places and asks impossible things of the people brave enough to accept it. The silence that followed my confession lasted exactly 7 seconds. I know because I counted them, each one stretching like an eternity while four righteous men processed what I'd just admitted. Then Sheriff Morrison found his voice, and everything exploded. "Harold Wilson," he said, his words sharp as broken glass, "you are no longer welcome in Pine Ridge. You have 48 hours to collect your belongings and leave this town permanently. If you're seen here after that, you'll be arrested for corrupting a minor and contributing to the delinquency of a young woman under your care." "She's 18, Harold said desperately. "Ruth is 18 years old, a legal adult. I haven't broken any laws." "You've broken God's law," Dr. Hartwell spat. "You've broken the laws of decency and morality that hold civilized society together. The fact that it might be technically legal doesn't make it any less disgusting." Mr. Anderson stepped forward, his face twisted with contempt. "Harold, you're fired. Effective immediately. Don't bother coming to the mill. Your final pay will be mailed to whatever address you end up at, assuming you find someone willing to hire a man with your proclivities." I felt Harold's hand tremble in mine, felt the weight of his entire life crashing down around us. The mill job wasn't just his livelihood, it was his identity, his place in the community, his connection to the respectable world he'd been part of for over a decade. "And as for you, young lady," Sheriff Morrison turned his attention to me, his voice shifting from authority to something that sounded almost like pity. "Your Aunt Margaret in Nashville has been contacted. She's agreed to take you in, help you readjust to proper society. A change of scenery, away from this corrupting influence, might help you remember who you're supposed to be." No, I said immediately, my voice fierce. I'm not going anywhere without Harold. I'm 18 years old, and I choose to stay with him. Ruth, Dr. Hartwell said, his tone patronizing and cruel, you're clearly not capable of making rational decisions. This man has obviously manipulated you, taken advantage of your grief and vulnerability. In time, you'll understand that we're trying to save you from a life of shame. The only shame I feel, I said, my voice rising with anger, is that I live in a town full of people who think love is something to be ashamed of. Harold never manipulated me. He never took advantage of me. He loved me, and I loved him back, and if that disgusts you, then maybe you're the ones with the problem. But it was useless. These men had made up their minds long before they knocked on our door. In their eyes, Harold was a predator and I was his victim, and nothing I said would convince them otherwise. They wanted to save me from him, and they wanted to punish him for corrupting me, and the fact that neither of those things was true didn't matter to them at all. 48 hours, Sheriff Morrison repeated. Both of you. If Ruth chooses to stay with Harold instead of going to her aunt's house, then she's making her bed and she can lie in it. But neither of you will do it in Pine Ridge. That's when I realized what they were really doing. They weren't just banishing Harold, they were banishing both of us. They were making us outcasts, ensuring that wherever we went, we'd carry the stench of scandal with us. We'd be the uncle and niece who ran away together, the family members who chose sin over propriety. No respectable community would welcome us once they knew our story. Where are we supposed to go? Harold asked, his voice hollow. That's not our concern, Dr. Hartwell replied coldly. There are places for people like you. Cities where morality isn't as strictly observed. Where you can live whatever degraded lifestyle you choose without corrupting decent people. He made it sound like they were doing us a favor, offering us the chance to live openly in some distant place where no one would care about our love. But I could see the trap they were setting. They wanted us to disappear into the anonymous masses of some big city, to become cautionary tale they could tell their children. The uncle and niece who gave in to temptation and lost everything. After the men left, Harold and I sat in our kitchen for the last time, holding hands across the table where we'd shared so many meals, so many conversations, so many stolen moments of happiness. I'm sorry, Harold said, his voice broken. Ruth, I'm so sorry. I've ruined your life. No, I said firmly. You saved my life. When Mama and Daddy died, I thought I'd never be happy again. You gave me a home, and safety, and love. If the price of that love is leaving this place behind, then it's a price I'm willing to pay. But where will we go? He asked. What kind of life can we have? I don't know, I admitted. But whatever kind of life it is, we'll have it together. And maybe that's enough. Maybe love is enough, even when everything else is taken away. 2 days later, we loaded everything we could fit into Harold's old Ford truck and drove away from Pine Ridge forever. I was 19 years old, and I was choosing exile with the man I loved over acceptance in a world that couldn't understand us. It was the hardest decision I'd ever made, and the easiest one too. We drove for 3 days before we found a place that would have us. Millfield, Arkansas, population 847, a town so small and forgotten that nobody asked too many questions about a young married couple with no wedding pictures and a story that didn't quite add up. Harold told the landlord we were newlyweds from Tennessee, that we'd eloped and needed a fresh start away from disapproving families. It wasn't entirely a lie, we had chosen each other over everything else, and we did need to disappear from the life we'd known. The landlord, a tired-looking man named Pete Carlson, just shrugged and said the rent was $12 a month for the little house on Elm Street, take it or leave it. We took it. That house became our whole world for the next 15 years. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people, and a living room with windows that looked out on nothing but empty fields and sky. It was smaller than the house in Pine Ridge, shabbier, lonelier, but it was ours in a way the other house never could have been. Here, we could be Harold and Ruth, husband and wife, without the weight of being uncle and niece crushing down on us every day. Harold found work at a grain elevator on the outskirts of town, loading trucks and maintaining equipment. It was hard physical labor that paid half what he'd made at the mill, but it was honest work, and the foreman didn't care where Harold had come from or why he'd left. I took in sewing and cleaning houses for the few families in town who could afford help. We lived quietly, carefully, always aware that our past could catch up with us if we weren't vigilant. The first years were the hardest. We had so little money that some weeks we had to choose between heating oil and groceries. Harold's hands, which had been soft from his supervisory position at the mill, became cracked and scarred from the rough work at the grain elevator. I learned to make meals from almost nothing, to mend clothes until they were more patches than original fabric, to smile at neighbors while wondering if they suspected anything about the couple who'd appeared in town with no family, no history, no connections to anyone or anywhere. The isolation was crushing sometimes. In Pine Ridge, despite everything, we'd been part of a community. People had known Harold since he was a boy, had watched me grow up after my parents died. Here, we were strangers, and we had to stay strangers. We couldn't get too close to anyone, couldn't risk friendships that might lead to questions about our past. When neighbors invited us to church socials or town gatherings, we politely declined. When women my age tried to start conversations about children and family, I deflected with talk about the weather. The loneliness sat between us sometimes like a third person at our kitchen table. Harold would come home from work exhausted and discouraged, and I'd see him looking at me with something that might have been regret. Not regret for loving me, but regret for what loving me had cost us both. "I destroyed your life," he said one evening during our second winter in Millfield, when the heating oil had run out and we were huddled together under every blanket we owned. "You should have been a teacher, or married some nice boy from Pine Ridge, had babies and a normal life. Instead you're here, in this freezing house, darning socks and pretending to be something you're not." "I am exactly what I want to be," I told him, though sometimes I wondered if that was true. "I'm your wife. Maybe not in the eyes of God or the law, but in every way that matters. I chose this life, Harold. I chose you." But the weight of our secret grew heavier every year. We couldn't have children, too risky, too many questions about bloodlines and family history. We couldn't travel, someone might recognize us, might remember the scandal of Harold Wilson and his niece. We couldn't even celebrate anniversaries, because how do you mark the anniversary of the night your uncle became your lover? So we marked smaller things. The day we found the house in Millfield. The first time Harold smiled again after we left Pine Ridge. The morning I woke up and realized I was happy, despite everything. Those became our holidays, private celebrations of survival and persistence and the stubborn refusal to let shame destroy what we'd built together. Slowly, very slowly, we built something that looked like a normal life. Harold was promoted to supervisor at the grain elevator. I started taking in more sewing, building a reputation for fine needlework. We bought a radio, then a better stove, then a car to replace Harold's aging truck. We learned to exist in the spaces between truth and lies, to be Harold and Ruth Crawford without forgetting we'd once been Harold and Ruth Wilson. Some nights, lying in our bed in that little house on Elm Street, listening to the wind blow across the empty fields, I'd think about the girl I'd been in Pine Ridge. The girl who'd fallen in love with her uncle and thought the world would end if anyone found out. That girl had been right about one thing: the world as we'd known it had ended. But we'd built a new world from the ashes of the old one, and if it was smaller and quieter and more careful, it was also more honest. We were still uncle and niece by blood, but we'd become something else through choice and time and the simple act of refusing to let go of each other. We'd become Harold and Ruth, two people who'd found love in an impossible place and decided it was worth keeping, no matter what it cost. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in 1958, 15 years after we'd left Pine Ridge. I was hanging laundry in our backyard when the mailman, Mr. Peterson, called out that there was something for Mrs. Crawford from Tennessee. My hands froze on the clothespin I was holding. Nobody from Tennessee should have known where to find us. Nobody from our old life should have been able to track down Harold and Ruth Crawford in Little Millfield, Arkansas. I took the letter with shaking hands, noting the return address, Pine Ridge General Store, attention Mrs. Helen Patterson. My blood turned to ice. After all these years, Mrs. Patterson had found us. The woman who'd watched us, documented our love, turned it into evidence against us, had somehow discovered where we'd disappeared to. Harold wasn't due home from the grain elevator for another 3 hours, but I couldn't wait. I tore open the envelope right there beside the mailbox, my heart pounding so hard I could barely focus on the handwriting. But what I read wasn't what I'd expected at all. Dear Ruth, the letter began, I hope this finds you well and happy, wherever life has taken you. I got your address from Mrs. Reynolds in Millerville, who remembered a young woman from Pine Ridge asking about forwarding mail. It took me some time to work up the courage to write this letter, and I'm not even sure you'll want to read it, but there are things I need to say. I looked around our quiet street, making sure no neighbors were watching, then sat down on our front steps to read the rest. I need to ask your forgiveness, Ruth. For what I did to you and Harold, for the role I played in driving you both away from home. I told myself I was protecting you, that I was saving you from a man who was taking advantage of your grief and vulnerability. I was wrong. Dead wrong, and I've carried the guilt of that wrongness for 15 years. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Mrs. Patterson, the woman I'd blamed for destroying our life in Pine Ridge, was apologizing. My own granddaughter came to live with me 2 years ago, after her parents died in a factory accident down in Memphis. Clara is 18 now, the same age you were when I stuck my nose where it didn't belong. Watching her grieve, watching her try to make sense of a world that took away everything she loved, I finally understood what you must have felt when your mama and daddy died. I understood what Harold gave you, not corruption, but comfort. Not manipulation, but love. I pressed the letter against my chest, overwhelmed by emotions I couldn't name. Vindication, relief, grief for the years we'd lost, anger that it had taken her so long to understand. Clara fell in love with a boy who works at the mill, Charlie Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's nephew. Good boy, but 5 years older than Clara, and folks started talking about whether it was appropriate. Sound familiar? That's when I realized I'd spent so much time watching other people's lives, judging other people's choices, that I'd forgotten how to mind my own business. I'd forgotten that love doesn't always follow the rules we think it should. The letter continued for 2 more pages, telling me about the changes in Pine Ridge, about people who'd asked after Harold and me over the years, about the regret that had grown in Mrs. Patterson's heart like a cancer. But it was the final paragraph that made me sob right there on our front steps. I don't know if you and Harold ever married, if you found happiness together, if you were able to build the life you wanted away from all the judgment and gossip. But I hope you did. I hope you found a place where love was more important than other people's opinions. You deserved that, both of you. You deserved better than what Pine Ridge gave you, and I'm sorry I wasn't wise enough to see it then. Please forgive an old woman who thought she knew better than the heart. Give my regards to Harold, if you think he can stand hearing the name Helen Patterson again. Tell him I said he was a better man than any of us deserved. When Harold came home that evening, he found me sitting at our kitchen table, the letter spread out in front of me, tears still wet on my cheeks. Ruth, he said, alarmed. What's wrong? What happened? I handed him the letter without saying a word, watched his face change as he read it. When he finished, he set it down carefully and looked at me with eyes full of wonder. She understands, he said quietly. After all these years, she finally understands. Does it change anything? I asked. Does it make the last 15 years easier? Harold thought about that for a long moment. No, he said finally. But it makes them feel worthwhile. Like maybe we weren't crazy for thinking love was worth the price we paid for it. That night, we sat on our front porch in Millfield, Arkansas, holding hands like we had on the porch in Pine Ridge so many years ago. The stars were the same, the love was the same, but something had shifted. For the first time since we'd left Tennessee, we weren't running from our past. We were just living our present. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Now here I sit, 86 years old, on the same front porch where Harold and I spent our last years together. He's been gone for 8 years now, passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, and sometimes I still catch myself listening for the sound of his footsteps on these old wooden boards. The house feels too big with just me in it, too quiet, too full of memories that nobody else shares or understands. But I'm not bitter about the choices we made. How could I be? Harold and I had 43 years together, 43 years of waking up next to the man I loved, of building a life that was ours and nobody else's, of proving that love really can survive anything if you're stubborn enough to hold on to it. We never did have children. Too risky, we always said, though the truth was we were too afraid that people would look at our babies and see the scandal written in their faces somehow. But we had each other, and we had this little house in Millfield, and we had the quiet satisfaction of knowing we'd chosen love over respectability and never once regretted it. Harold never stopped being the gentlest man I've ever known. Even when his hair went white and his hands got arthritic from all those years of hard labor, even when his back bent and his steps got slower, he still looked at me like I was something precious. Like I was worth everything he'd given up for me. And I suppose I was, the same way he was worth everything I'd given up for him. Mrs. Patterson wrote to us 3 more times over the years, and we even wrote back once. She told us about her granddaughter Clara, who did marry Charlie Henderson despite the age difference, despite the gossip, despite all the busybodies who thought they knew better. Clara and Charlie had 5 children and a long, happy marriage, and Mrs. Patterson lived to see that love triumph over other people's opinions. She died in 1974, and her last letter to us included an apology for her granddaughter, asking if we might consider coming back to Pine Ridge for the funeral. We didn't go, but we sent flowers. White roses, because those were what Harold used to pick for me from the wild bushes behind our house when we were courting in secret. People in Millfield still think Harold and I were just a regular married couple who never had children. They don't know our story, don't know what we survived to be together. Sometimes I think about telling someone, about finding a young person who's struggling with love that doesn't fit the pattern everyone expects, and saying, "Listen, child. I loved my uncle, and he loved me back, and we built a life on that love that lasted longer than most marriages. The heart wants what it wants, and sometimes what it wants is impossible, and sometimes you have to choose between being happy and being acceptable. But mostly I just sit here on this porch, wearing the ring that belonged to my mother, the ring I've worn for 70 years now, and I remember. I remember the girl who fell in love with her guardian. I remember the man who chose love over reputation. I remember the life we built together, one careful day at a time, in a world that didn't have room for people like us. I remember it all, and I'm grateful for every minute of it, even the hard parts, even the scary parts, even the parts that cost us everything we thought we needed. Because in the end, we didn't need anything except each other. Some people will hear this story and call it sinful. They'll say Harold and I were wrong, that we corrupted something sacred, that we gave in to temptation when we should have been stronger. And maybe they're right. Maybe what we did goes against every rule in the book about how families should love each other, how guardians should protect their wards, how decent people should behave. But here's what I know after 86 years on this earth: love isn't decent. Love isn't polite. Love doesn't ask permission or follow rules or care about what other people think it should look like. Love just is. It shows up in your heart when you least expect it, in forms you never imagined, asking impossible things of you. And when it does, you have 2 choices: you can fight it until it destroys you both, or you can surrender to it and see where it takes you. Harold and I chose surrender. We chose each other over everything else, over reputation, over comfort, over the approval of people who thought they knew better than our hearts did. Was it easy? Lord, no. Did it cost us everything we thought we wanted? Absolutely. But did we regret it? Not for one single day. Because at the end of it all, when Harold was dying in that hospital bed in Little Rock and I was holding his hand and he looked at me with those same gentle eyes that had loved me for over 40 years, he whispered, "Ruth, if I had to do it all again, if I had to choose between being your uncle or being your husband, I'd choose you every time." That's what real love looks like. Not the pretty, packaged version they sell you in movies and romance novels, but the raw, complicated, impossible kind that asks you to risk everything and promises you nothing except that you won't face the world alone. So if this old woman's story touched something in your heart, if it made you think about love in a different way, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear that love comes in all shapes and sizes, that the heart doesn't follow society's rules, that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones nobody talks about. Leave a comment below and tell me about your own impossible love, your own choice between what's expected and what's true. And don't forget to follow this channel, because Grandma has more stories to tell, more secrets to share, more truths that need speaking. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do, tell our truth and hope somebody, somewhere, understands that love is worth whatever price you pay for it.